Since the damaging of Earth, it has been well noted that the Chitters are well within their means to strike out, as they had already cleared an entire planet. The Zells, on the other hand, don't reproduce or build at a level that the Chitters can, and their fleet was just barely ready to hold their own planet. However, they still insisted on one or two ships to go with us as we reached out beyond our own cradle sector to free another planet that didn't even have an alliance with us. Unlike the Zell and the Chitters, they did not know. The Veretans, if I'm pronouncing that right, are a type of mammalian species. If you look at them, it would be very, very difficult to actually separate them from human at first, until you realize that they have some animalistic capabilities, or presentation is more like it. Though they have a stronger sense of hearing and smell than we do, you can actually tell that they resemble, I don't know if you consider that cat or dog. The pointy ears could go either way, and the way their faces are arched, you really can't tell. Their noses don't exactly do the whole anime thing, so you really, really have a hard time. However, their long, stretched tail does act more feline than canine, so we'll just go with that. Though the one major issue with these particular species is that they are unbelievably thin and incredibly frail. At least by human standards, that is. I would worry about picking one up wearing my exosuit, as I would be afraid of snapping it in half, quite literally. They are very, very lean, and because of which, and that the fact they do not reproduce all that quickly, they are used more for decorative slaves than anything else. Housemates and personal after hours type slaves. When we found this one out, is that they were particularly used for this. Well, you can imagine how interested everyone was on getting a hold of those who would enslave these such small, skinny ones that we just wanted a piece of them. Normally, before a mission, you would hear a whole bunch of people laughing and joking, trying to make light of a heavy situation as they got everything ready. But no, this time when we found out how poorly that they treated them, about as poor as they treated the ones that were created, similar to my crew. The demonics is what I like to call them, but that's not really their name. They, well, they took it very personal. As we got everything ready, the fleet was assembled. Not only was there human, but along with human mixed into us was our new AI compatriots. The AI didn't seem to have any problem working with us and ran many of our drones and many of our guns. It also helped to fix a lot of the equipment that was in too tight a position for us to actually work on. As good as these ships are, there's still some tight crevices that you gotta get in and out of when things are required. All in all, we were still ready to rock and roll, using AI to supplement our lack of manpower. The Chitters, however, showed up with a massive amount of personnel. However, their ships were very, very, very basic. I cannot stress this enough. The only ones that were accentuated in any way, shape, or form was their massive carriers. These carriers resembled something similar to a wasp nest, if I had to put a finger on it, although I was invited inside once and it looks absolutely nothing like it. It's very compartmentalized, similar to the way humans would design it. And when I did ask one of their betas, yeah, there are different levels. There's alpha betas, gammas, omegas, and of course the S class, as we like to call them, i.e. the queens. But the queens almost never left their planet. But I asked one of the betas why they designed it this way, and they simply stated how it was designed based off human designs. They realized that we were extremely efficient, especially when it came to military vessels. Couldn't argue with them there. When it came to the Zells, they would stick close to my ship. I had gotten the call sign Godfather because they heard Junior constantly calling me that. I didn't want to use that call sign, but you know what? Sometimes it just sticks. As they stayed close to my frigate, we got the countdown, getting ready to jump into alien space. It would be a single jump, and of course our allies would have to be close. They use standard FTL, we use jump systems. There's a lot of differences to them, but the main one is the FTL, you can see it coming. You have several minutes before they actually reach inside the sector to the planet. The jumps will simply, you'll appear. The only problem with the jump systems is that, one, it drains your energy, and sometimes you're adrift for up to a minute as your system cycles back up to life. Also, if you jump into the wrong area and end up inside a gravity well or close enough to it, well, chances are you're going to be yanked out of whatever command couch you are and smushed up against the side. Newtonian physics is still a thing, of course. But our scouts had looked at it very, very closely, and we would be on the far side away from their 2 moons. Yes, they have 2, which is not surprising. We have our own planets in our own system that have 7, 8, 9 moons, so why the hell not? As we got ready, I could hear everyone counting down. I ordered all my crew into their fighters. I would be the one in the frigate this time, as I trusted them to get the job done. Plus, I wanted to keep my eye on the action, just in case we had to get out fast, or if I had to jump in for some reason. I could hear the countdown still going. They counted from 60. It's hitting 30. As I locked in, I started calling out, "Ping when you're ready," and I could see all the lights going from red to green. Everyone was ready. 15, 14. I looked out. As I opened my eyes, I could see the 2 ships that were from the Zells just off to my port side. They were close enough I could see them. They were within my jump bubble, but only one would be jumping with me. Another jump bubble would be from another frigate just on the other side of them. 4, 3, and just like every other time I jumped, the pucker factor jumped. 2, 1, jump! And with that, we all jumped simultaneously. We all blinked into the next sector, and it only took a few moments before everyone's system seemed to be coming back to life. Anything destroyer size or larger always had a separate engine specifically for this purpose. That way you weren't left off in the ether when you jumped in. You had the ability to turn your turrets immediately and fire if need be. But when we jumped in, we didn't see any resistance. We didn't see too much except some cargo haulers and a few small warships. Nothing beyond the size of a frigate. What in the hell? Well, I guess we caught them with their pants down. Immediately, we got the word to power up and head straight towards the planet. As we were going, I could hear over the net the chitters call out to everybody how they will send drones out to make sure the air is clear, and they will make sure that they are the first ones to reach the planet. The call came out from our own commands and said, "Really? You want to bet on that?" The chitters didn't understand. What do you mean? What is bet? We'll call it a gentleman's wager. Just kind of bragging rights. Say I was there first. So you want to see who hits the ground first? And with that, the Alpha chimed in. "Yes, absolutely. Let us see who is there first. Yes. Let's see who gets to the surface first. Let's see who takes the fight to these slave trading sons of those things. Dog, female dog. Those things." I still can't believe he can't pronounce that word. It was just amazing me. I was snickering as I saw many ships power up and got into an extreme race on the way to the surface. They couldn't outpace the fighters, and as I released my own, I saw them burst off in front of me. My frigate was good. It was brand new, but it could not match the thrust-to-mass ratio of any of these fighters, not even close. I was basically in full burn on my gravimetric drive as we just kept going. I could even see the small bursts as satellites were being blasted out of the atmosphere and also out of orbit. There was a little bit of resistance coming from one of their moons. We could see them coming, and a few of their warships got into positions to fire. However, I'm not even sure if they did. Looking through my sensors, I suddenly saw them disappear. They didn't have jump tech. I reached my sensors as far as I could, and I was just barely able to catch a debris field. You sneaky pilots, you. I wonder if that was the AI or who was that. But somebody just launched a torpedo up its backside. I began scanning again, looking across to see if there's any in any direction. I could tell that there were scans going out in every and all directions. We were all confused. Shouldn't there be more? I know they're within some sort of conflict with the other slave masters, but you would think they would leave some sort of defense. I mean, they're out here on the edge, but still, it doesn't make sense. They're smarter than this. And I always worry when things go too easy. But then again, it's never that easy. As my frigate got close enough to the planet, I could see that the chitters were beginning to send in their assault craft so that they could be on the ground. One of the alphas actually got onto the comms and stated to everyone, You see, we are faster. We are faster. We will be on the surface faster. We will take this planet before you." And that is when our own transports simply arced themselves and began to launch pods down. As the pods went screaming past the Chitter's transports towards the surface, all we got from the XO of our flagship going, you were saying something? I swear if that Chitter knew how to curse like a human, he would have. Because all we got was unintelligible clicks and screeches across there. And with that, their transport seemed to turn straight towards the surface instead of trying to slowly get through there to maximize their abilities and also to not burn up. They simply seem to be in a race with the pods, but you can't outrace a pod. That thing's going more than terminal velocity towards the surface. Obviously, the pods got there first. And as we landed, we tried our best to make sure that communications never went out, but never ever the things go that simple. Oh crap. Over by one of the moons, we could see other ships beginning to come in. My sensors were going absolutely nuts as we saw several ships beginning to come out of their FTL as they got very close. So close that I saw one of their own frigates come out of FTL and immediately bank off hard towards one of the moons. It had to turn itself away and burn as hard as it could to make sure it didn't get caught up in the gravity well and crash. Dumbasses, you're in too much of a hurry. With that, I got it in command with all the rest of the fleet. We coordinated everything we could. We got in our formation and began to sweep from one side of the planet to another. It was glorious as we came up on one side, just below the equator on the southern hemisphere, and as we got within optimal reference range, we opened up and spread out across the planet. It seemed to be this huge concentric circle that opened wider and wider as it began to go around the planet on all sides. The poles, the equators, each hemisphere, all had ships coming around to meet the fleets coming on the other side. That way they would always be able to bring their guns to bear. The other fleet didn't recognize what we were doing, and they learned way too late. Before I even cleared the planet, I checked in with my fighters, and they were doing their standard strafing runs. I checked their ordnance. None of them had fired torpedoes yet. There wasn't any large targets to hit. Most of them had fired their missiles off to take care of any in-atmosphere aircraft that were coming their way. But most of the aircraft that were coming their way weren't really military aircraft, at least not designed to take anything that they've got that was coming towards them. Instead, what my crew ended up having to do was strafe the enemy positions, which is hard to do at that speed, but again, with turrets, it became a little bit easier. I grinned at how well and efficient they had become. They had become very well trained, and they were excellent at their job. I know because I trained them all. Even the youngest was there. And even as I checked her vitals, she was calm and cool and collected as she began to do a strafing run and drop several of the last of her ordnance into an enemy position that was trying to stop our own drop troopers. Well, let's just say they weren't stopping anyone after that. My ship began to clear the outer part of the planet. and I began to get a straight line view into the enemy fleet that was coming in. Well, what was left of them? I was one of the mid-level ships, which means I was second line, not third line. And as we started coming through, I could just barely see as their destroyers and one of their battleships that had come in were being torn asunder by the turrets of our main battleships. The Chitter fleet was just absolutely ruthless as they began to swarm through the entire formation, just strafing and ripping everything apart. At one point, they even crashed headlong into a small carrier. We were told to hold our fire against the carrier as they wanted to take this ship, and take it they did. I remember seeing the video of what they did inside, and it was gruesome. And I laughed. As I saw the movements they were doing were reminiscent of everything humans had done before. It seems like they had taken all their cues off of us. I wonder if their hive mind had its own mind at that point, but I didn't have time to worry about it. We were having basically a turkey shoot at this point. It was at that point we noticed that all the FTL signatures that were coming in had stopped short. They had come out of FTL so they could change the directions they were at, and they just got back in FTL and went another direction. They must have realized that they were severely outgunned, and they had no chance, even if they came in. As they were coming in 1, 2, 3, 4, a half a dozen at a time, you can't face a whole fleet that way. And as I said, these guys aren't that stupid. The battle for space was over before I even was able to empty half of my torpedo tubes. Hell, I'm not even sure if it mattered if I fired. So I turned my ship and I radioed my crew to see if anybody needed a refit, anybody needed anything. To my absolute shock and surprise, not only the Chitters, but the Zells on the ground and the drop troops have already cleared a landing zone big enough for my ship to go down. I called up to the command and said that I could go and give them support. I was told to hand off, just wave off for right now. They were sending their own destroyers down. The frigates would come later, as the frigates did not carry as much ordnance. However, they could definitely do their job. It was a long 6.5 hours, a very long 6.5 hours, as our own groups, our own soldiers, our own troops, buggers, whatever the hell you want to call them, made their way across the planet, and all I could do was link into a couple of the helmet cameras and see what was going on. As they went through, it was amazing to see that many of the slave traders would jump out in the street, raising their hands, screaming, "Please don't shoot us, please don't shoot us, we'll sell you our slaves." Yeah, that would be the last thing they said. Some of them would run out with the slaves in hand and offer them up, begging for their own lives. Our own men would walk up to each of these, many of them much smaller than us, reach down with their exosuit-covered hands and effortlessly snap those collars off. And many times, the slaves would look at the collar on the ground, reach up, grab their necks, and realize that they're free. We had known most of the languages, and we had it translated so that they could learn that they are free now. They have no master. And at that point, many of those that were slave masters would actually say, they still obey me. That's another wrong answer. And it was just funny to see one of these mammalian assholes just look all sorts of proud, saying, "Oh, I'm safe now. I didn't hurt them much." They looked down at the kids, and one of them was walking funny. Even if it wasn't for the reason we thought, it wouldn't have mattered, as that massive metal-covered hand curled into a fist and clocked the son of a bitch, knocking most of his teeth out of his head and watching his head just crunch in. He laid there on the ground, screaming in agony, at least what you could scream, as basically a muffle, as he thrashed on the ground with all sorts of pain going through his body. The young ones that looked at this were afraid. They looked at the one who still had blood dripping from his fist. He looked at his fist and realized what they were seeing. He simply put his hand behind his back, and then with his non-bloody hand, reached out and got down on one knee at the same time, reaching out friendly for them to touch, for them to realize he is not a threat to them. Some of these creatures, now that I can tell the difference, couldn't be more than a decade or two old. Most slaves are not kept very long once they pass the age of maturity, unless they're used for more disgusting means. And I don't just mean what you're thinking about, but also as basically alien death matches, similar to the type of games we were forced to endure when this whole thing first started. And here we were, looking at kids who had been groomed for this. I still remember looking down at that one. One of the cameras had looked at him, this slave master, as he was holding the side of his jaw. He simply pulled out his pistol and blew this guy's head off. And I mean off. He didn't stop firing until the magazine was completely empty and all 15 rounds had gone into the skull and splattered it. Then I realized by checking the stats that this trooper that had done that had lost their family in the assault on Earth. I guess this was a personal one. I had to remind myself to remind everybody that when you're a professional, you do everything you can not to make it personal. Though it was difficult in this type of war, which is the first justified war I could ever think about. And as I still sat there waiting for my turn to go down to the surface, I simply watched again and again the same thing happening. Our forces would go into a town or a city, find all the slave masters and the slaves. If the slave masters surrendered and simply wanted amnesty, well, that's too freaking bad now. You shouldn't have tried to cook our planet, asshole. If they tried to hold slaves as human shields or xeno shields, if you want to call it that, well, no one had any chill. We did feel bad for those we had to shoot through, but they had to learn really quick that that was in no way, shape, or form going to protect you. One of our own broke down in tears as one of these slave masters, a large kind of arthropod-looking, I don't even know what species that is off the top of my head, came out holding two females by their hair, somehow had it wrapped around in their claw. He was a big son of a buck too. Must have been good 13, 14 feet tall. He may have been holding them by their hair, but it was by the back of their head and lifting them up. In other words, they were being held by their hair. They were screaming in pain, trying to reach up to their hair to try and alleviate some of the pressure. And as he did, he reached around with some sort of weapon and fired into. He got a couple of the chitters and wounded one of the humans. And without hesitation, this man who was in charge turned his weapon on full auto and fired into that behemoth, blasting away as fast as he could to try and take him down, straight through the slaves he was using as shields. And as he went up, as the slave master fell, he went up to the slave master, who was still thrashing around a little bit, shoved the barrel of his weapon into his maw and pulled the trigger and just said, "Don't ever do that again." And then he looked at the two slaves, both obviously humanoid, as most things are, but one was a demonoid similar to that which is part of my crew. The other was human. Both females were there bleeding out. He dropped his rifle, went to them, and tried to patch him up. He was screaming for a medic, and I could hear the sheer horror in his voice. and the pain that was there as he tried his best with a little first aid kit he had to try and save them both. But multiple high caliber gunshot wounds, all he could do was alleviate their pain just a little bit. He reached up with that small little syringe of morphine that he had. He wasn't supposed to carry it. None of them were, but they always did. He jabbed the morphine into the leg of the demonoid, who was worse off than the human. The human, still crying in pain. He tried to hold her hand. He raised his visor so she could see that he was human. And she just asked, "Why did this happen? Why did this have to happen? Why?" With that, his own buddy came over and jabbed a different syringe into the leg of the human. Both the human and demonoid at that point stopped screaming. And less than a minute later, they both slumped, as there was nothing anyone could do. That soldier stayed there the entire rest of the battle, kneeling in front of both of them. His visor still raised. A stray shot could have taken him out easy. But he was done. He was broken in that moment. I remember looking on the video of his buddies trying to get him going, their cameras spinning back around, but he was still there. We would find out 2 days he knelt there. 2 days until his body just gave out on him and fell over himself. They were able to get him back to one of the medical frigates, but I'm pretty sure he's done. You don't have PTSD that bad and just wipe it away. With things like that coming across the net, more and more of our own soldiers began to look at the slave masters as simple target practice. They weren't even sentient species anymore in their eyes. If they were going to hold up their own pleasure slaves as shields, meat shields, it was insane. Several times the chitters, those who were drones that were meant to help out, they're gammas, they're the ones you would see in a cargo bay all the time, being used as rudimentary weapons as they were thrown at our own forces, striking with enough force to knock our people over. If it struck another chitter, it might have enough to crack his carapace, but it wasn't enough to keep him down. And every single time more slaves died, the more angry our people got. I could hear the call over the radio for them to hold up at a certain phase line. But our people didn't stop. The chitters didn't stop. The Zell that had seen their own torn apart right in front of them as not only as shields, but also they found young ones that were being trained to be good, obedient servants. They found them sometimes all scarred up, missing parts, or sometimes, if they were lucky, they would just have seen things they really didn't want to. They came at them like amphetamine-soaked circus monkeys, jumping on any slave master, and if they couldn't shoot it, they would do what any human would do. They grabbed their knife and they just started hacking away, screaming all sorts of obscenities, which are hilarious when translated to English, but in their own culture is some of the worst things you could ever possibly say. At the end of that 6.5 hours, I was finally given clearance to land. I was about ready to say screw it and just go in, using my own point defense systems, but I found out really quick why they wanted us to hold back. The planetary defenses were not exactly knocked out. We couldn't use any type of orbital bombardment. We're not trying to destroy the planet. We're trying to free its people. So what were we limited to? We were limited to something that I would have to get installed on this ship. The AI had drones, and we would launch them out. These were kamikaze drones launched out by the dozens, sometimes hundreds, to seek and destroy. Order times of several hours. They would simply find some sort of weapon emplacement, some sort of vehicle, something, and they would come down at a speed that was almost incomprehensible. as they burst a small little rocket, and you could see them all smashing down on the enemy defenses. As the enemies tried to garrison what they could and get into their own ships, our drones and our bigger guns would come in. Our fighter craft dodged and weaved through all sorts of fire, unfortunately not all making it, but would do everything they could just to get one single strafing run on the enemy headquarters. Anything, as they could not quell their anger at what they had seen on the ground, and I cheered them on. As I finally broke through the atmosphere, I called out again for my crew, for anyone, if they wanted to restock, to get their butts back to the frigate. To my shock and dismay, only one came back. He was trailing all sorts of smoke as 2 of his 4 engines were just gone, just completely gone. I looked as he flew by, trying to get a good angle to land. I opened up the starboard hatch way in the back and told him to be ready, because that's not going to be a fun landing. There was no way he could use any of his anti-grav motors at that point. Not on only 2 engines he couldn't, especially since the 2 that were gone were his starboard side. They were just... And when he crashed in, it was enough to make the entire ship shudder. Thankfully, I could see through the video that he did land and he was in one piece. His fighter, on the other hand, not so much. I'm just glad he didn't have any ordnance left over. Somehow he had actually used his torpedoes. I don't know on what, nor did I give a crap. All I knew is I was glad he was there. I got on the PA system and told him to go straight to the medical facility. Right now, get your ass to the aid station, was all I screamed. Thankfully, he went there without hesitation. I was just hoping the fire suppression system was still intact, just in case that fighter decided to go a little hot. Thankfully, it didn't. But seeing this was enough for me. I did a closed circuit frequency burst out to my own fighters, and I told them, "This is Godfather Actual. If you're hearing me, get your ass back here now." I say again, get back to me. I'm pinging my location now. And with that, I sent the beacon out. I must have got a little bit more attention because we saw a whole bunch, at least what was left, of their in-atmosphere fighters seem to be homing in on my location. As I looked through the sensors, I saw several of the fighters coming back, but it wasn't all of them. I counted 1, 2, 3, 4. I just kept counting as they started coming in. I opened all the doors that needed to get them in. Thankfully, only one other was trailing smoke, as one of the engines had taken a hit, but it looked like it was recoverable. They were able to still do their vertical takeoff and landing procedures and land inside the bay without a problem. As soon as they locked in, the automated system started to rearm their fighters. I told them to get out, get to the medical bay, and get checked. And yet I still looked around. I'm missing 2. Where are they? I started looking for their transponder signals, and I found them. Without any type of clearance, I began to move the frigate towards their location. Thankfully, they were pretty close to each other, only just over a quarter of a kilometer away from each other. But I knew if they were on the ground, then all hell was going to be coming down on them. I looked, and our forces had just barely reached their location. As I got the frigate close, I could start feeling it start shaking left and right as more and more fire started coming in. The guns started firing in all different directions. The AI was doing exactly what it needed to, but I needed to get my people out. And as we got close, I could almost hear those on the ground screaming as the turrets began to blast enemy positions. This was a bad idea, but I didn't care. I wanted my crew. My crew was my family, and I would not leave them behind, not for anything. As we got close to the first crash site, I looked and I could see my pilot. She was waving up to us. I simply got close as I could. She couldn't reach me, unfortunately, but I got on the PA system. "Just go to the rally point. Just go to the rally point. I'll pick you up there." She simply waved and gave me the OK symbol, and she started running. Thankfully, my own soldiers, the own Terran soldiers, along with those of the Chitters, had reached her location, and she was able to run right past the line. They realized from the way she was dressed that she was a pilot, so they didn't even stop to ask. And it was on to the next crash. And as I got within visual range, my heart couldn't take what I was seeing. The fighter had crashed into the ground, but had not landed flat. It had skidded across the ground from God knows what type of fire it had taken. I hoped, I prayed that they ejected, as the front of the fighter was buried in the side of the building. The only thing left showing was the ass end of this thing, its engines, which seemed to be intact, but that was all I could see. I started looking around, looking for any type of transponder signal. My brain was going 90 miles an hour. Even the AI was telling me, slow down, you are reaching burnout. I didn't care. I started looking around everywhere I could, but I couldn't see him. Where was he? Where was he? For the love of God, you better have ejected, you pain in my ass. Where are you? Where are you? Come on. Where are you, you purple piece of shit? At that point, my frigate started taking all sorts of hits as I was being shaken left, right, center, all the way back. I got hit almost right next to the bridge, and it was enough to shake me out of my haze. I couldn't stay there, not without dropping this frigate right in the middle of the city. So I had to power up. I raised myself far enough away from their ground-based weapons, and then far enough away from their missiles. I started crying. I couldn't keep in the tears. My whole crew started screaming through the comms, "What are you doing? Why are we leaving? Why are we going into orbit?" I had to tell them that we were taking too many hits. We had to go before we weren't spaceworthy anymore. One of my compartments had already been blown open. Thankfully, it was one of the cargo holds that didn't have anything in it at the time. I'll have to get it fixed later, but for right now, we just have to lick our wounds. Once in space, we started checking out the fighters. Most of them had taken some sort of damage, and at least 3 of them wouldn't be going anywhere anytime soon, and one of them was just about scrap. When he came in and crashed in, he had been smart enough to actually turn the fighter sideways, but unfortunately he had hit he had hit the engines that were still good. They weren't good anymore. That thing would need a complete and total refit before he's ever flying in it again. The other ones were probably going to take another day before the automated systems were able to repair everything. The other ones just simply needed a refit, more ordnance, and cooled off. But I told them that we're missing one. They all wanted to go back and look for him, but it was too hot. I was catching word from the command that we had finally pinned them down, the slave masters. They had just rallied everything they could, and they had bunkered themselves down. But they had bunkered themselves down in the most heavily defended portion of the entire hemisphere. Any fighters were told to back off. They were just getting picked off left and right. As good as our fighters were, even stealth rigged, it wouldn't matter. Dumb munitions are still going to hit you. They'll hit you if you're fired at. With that, we had to wait. And I hate waiting. Eventually, I did get a call. "Yeah, Colonel, we got one of your pilots down here. You want to come? You don't have to tell me anything else. Just ping your location." He sent it, and immediately I sent the frigate down. By the time we had landed, I saw that she was okay. A little tore up from the landing, which I don't know why the hell she didn't eject, which I did scream at her for. But I did reach over, pick her up, and hold her tight. I don't want to lose anyone else. And that's when I got the call. Sir? Yeah? Sir, we found another one of yours." "Where is he?" He's in the MASH, sir. They're taking care of him." "Which one?" "Sir, don't worry about that." By the time he had said that, I had already started moving towards the closest one. I had to see make sure he was okay, but the guards stopped me before I got there. I wasn't wearing an exosuit, and they were. It wouldn't take much for them to put me to the ground. I told them what was going on, and they knew who I was, but they still held me back. Good men, they did their job, despite the orders of an officer. They knew what had to be done. So we had to wait. My frigate would not move until we found out what happened. And when the word came down, we were all together. I ran out to find out what was going on. And as I got up to one of the guards, he was there standing like a statue in his exosuit. I couldn't see his face. And without hesitation, he reached up, hit a small button on the side. His visor raised up, and I could see his eyes. I didn't have to know anymore. I just partially broke right there. He didn't make it. From what they could gather, he had ejected out, but where he landed was all sorts of enemy activity. He tried to make it out, but he got hit several times, and there just wasn't anything they could do for him. As good as our medical technology is, they said they were in the process of rebuilding his internal organs. It's like, come on, our medical tech is so good, it just needs his head to... Oh, fuck. The guard simply looked, shook his head, and I could see that he really didn't want to remember what he had seen. I simply raised myself up, turned to the crew, and shook my head no. Most of the youngest ones started breaking down in tears at that point. The older ones tried to stay stoic and tried to keep the other ones' spirits from falling into the gutter, but losing our first one was enough. With that, I just looked over and I saw the bag being brought out. I walked over, checked the tag. It was him. We began to reach for the bag, bring it over, and I could see the look in my crew's eyes. And I simply said, "All right, let's get off this rock at least 1 kilometer up." They all looked at me, and I could see the hate in their eyes as they knew what this meant. You wanted to get at least 1 kilometer off the ground so you could launch fighters. Launching them on the ground is dangerous at the best of times, unless you have some sort of catapult that's going to launch them straight up. Even with the anti-grav systems, floating around that low inside a city is just not smart. We got in, they got in their fighters, and those that were still being worked on were being worked on with insane abandonment as I watched the rest of the fighters burst free once I just sat there at 1,000. I got on the comms to the one who had crashed his fighter into the frigate. I said, "Hey, what are you doing?" He yelled back up into the comms, "I'm helping him fix it." "No, you're not. Go to my fighter now. She's already armed and ready to go. I want you off this boat in 30 seconds. And without hesitation, he ran off, and I could watch his movements as he went down, opened up my own fighter, and jumped inside, realizing that I had jazzed the thing up as best I could. Strapping in, I opened up the doors, and before they were even open, he powered up and off he went. It didn't take long for him to catch up. By the time our fighters had even engaged the enemy again, their defense lines had been broken. We had complete space and air dominance, and our own people began strafing and bombing the living bejesus out of what was left. But we couldn't just raze it to the ground. We didn't know who was inside. And when I recalled the fighters again, we had to sit and watch as those on the ground went room to room, door to door, hallway to hallway, floor by floor, clearing them all and taking every single one of the natives back. When it was all said and done, the planet itself was free. Its infrastructure was fucked, which we knew we could fix in a matter of a few weeks. but the planet itself was free. Its own people were free. They kind of looked at us strange, as why would we even bother doing this? We didn't have an alliance with them. Why? Well, we didn't have an alliance yet, we told them. And with that, we began the long process of rebuilding. We did find humans on that planet. Unfortunately, very few of them actually survived. Many of them were executed by their own slave masters, as they had figured out that's who we were by the way we moved. Never underestimate your opponent. One of the slave masters, begged for his life, holding out the two humans on one side and one human on the other. These were kids. And what those soldiers did to that slave master, oh, lordy lord. She ought to be glad she wasn't a guy. They would have ripped off something very important right away. But as a few of the soldiers I could tell were women by the way they cradled these kids as they took them away. They guarded their eyes to make sure they didn't see what our soldiers were going to do with those who take humans and do bad things to them. 'Cause you don't hurt kids, asshole, was the last thing that alien ever heard. The planet is now free. And our very first step into clearing this entire universe has been taken. It's going to be a long road, a very long one. But with what I've seen our own people do, along with our new allies, I can only wonder that with each planet, each home planet that is, with each species that is freed, what they will do to their own slave masters simply boggles the mind. Although I didn't have time to worry about that, because as we all know, freedom comes at the cost of blood, and we have already paid. We will continue to do so, but as my ship rose up high and we headed towards the nearest star, I could see it in my crew's eyes, and I kind of saw it in my own reflection. We wondered for a moment, is it worth it? Is losing our people worth it? As we got ready for the funeral, and as we did, as we set everything ready to launch him back into the stars where he was created, I looked over on the other side of the body and I saw the new additions to my crew. I was told that my crew of demonoids would be probably the best idea, as they found several more of them across the planet. Still, they may be in small numbers, but it would be best to keep them with their own kind, and I couldn't possibly agree more. This was important. This was bigger than the price we had paid, and if I end up having to pay this price as well, as long as they survive, it would be worth it. Normally at this point I'd be heading back to Earth, but that's not my home anymore, and I couldn't go back if I wanted to. It's a restricted zone. Nobody goes down there until it heals itself. So after the funeral, I came to a striking realization as I began training the new crew members on what to do. This is my life now. This is my new life out here in the stars. And I'm right where I need to be. And a good thing, too, because as we know, nothing combines enemies together faster than a common enemy. That was us. We were the enemy because we dared stand against them. We dare stop this god-awful slave trade that was killing billions, trillions across the universe. It would take us a long time to reach the other side, but until then, I'm gonna get ready to kick some serious alien ass.